tired.
So the good news, tired, I hear you, Arthur. The good news is it's the last one. Oh, yeah, that was pitiful. It's the last one, and then you're done. Wow, that was so disappointing. You're on. This is like definitely the doldrum. So it's the hardest part of the year. It's the busiest time of your year. I feel like you have a test like Q3 day, and you do. And so just hang in there. It's almost here. Like you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. By now, a lot of people feel that the fourth test is the best test for most people because by now you've probably figured out what works and what doesn't. And if you're still trying to figure that out, you got a whole other test to do it. It's the longest period between your tests, so you have the most amount of time to master the material, which is nice. And then a lot of people find this stuff much more tangible than they do the rest. Lab is a little bit better because it's a confined space, so this test isn't quite as bad as the rest of them in most people's opinion. I am going to attempt to get through all of cranial nerves with you guys in 3 separate courses. Hopefully the last one will be really short for cranial nerves, and I can do like kind of an overview of some other things too that I think are high yield. Do y'all feel like the last little review thing helped you for the test? Yes. Okay, good. So I'll try to do something very similar to that with like the last one that we do. Who is not going home for Thanksgiving? Who's staying here to study? We have 2 honest people. 3 honest people.
I don't have a house.
So I'll be sure that you take care of yourself and you get something to eat and you do something to make you feel normal for Thanksgiving. And if you're from here, be kind and invite those people over to your house for Thanksgiving dinner. We had a huge potluck at one of my friend's house when I was in M1, for those of us that did not get home. Okay, so I've got some things on the board that you probably already know, but we will refer to them. If you went to MC, I know that you know them. And we'll refer to them as we continue and go over cranial nerves. I'm very systematic. I do everything the same way every single time. So I encourage you that before you start studying cranial nerves, you always write these 2 things down, the 2 things that I have on both sides of the board. One of them goes through all 12 and it tells you is it motor, sensory, or both. It's a little mnemonic to help you remember if you can't tell the difference. And then the other thing is something that if you went to MC, you know how to use and you know it well. It's, I don't know what you would call it, but it's just like a little rhyme to help you remember which fiber types are in which nerve. You'll use this a lot. You'll especially use it at the beginning of neuroanatomy when you cover cranial nerves again in depth. So I'll tell you how to do it for those of you who don't know. Has anybody never seen this before? Okay, a lot of you. Okay, so let's go through it. So it's a system how you do it, and it helps you to write it the same way every time. So I can see this one a little bit better, but you guys have that one over there. It's the same thing. So up at the top, if you were watching me, what I did first is I wrote out the phrase, save Virginia, save base. So that's what these letters are. Okay? So S-A-V-E, V-A, S-A-V-E, V-A, S-E. So you write it in space. You space it out along the paper. So save Virginia, save base. The next thing you do is you add, at the beginning, 3 S's and 4 G's. So save Virginia, save base, add 3 S's and 4 G's. That gets you all of your fiber types. So that's all 7. We'll talk about the 3 new ones we're introducing in just a second. So after you get your fiber types, now you've got to know which cranial nerves have them. So that's where you get all these numbers from. So the little rhyme goes, I have a brother who is 28. He lives in the first column. So 28. He lives in the middle of 51, 53 crossroads. Crossroads is nothing. Okay, but the middle is the middle column's first row. Okay, so I have a brother who is 28. He lives in the first row. He lives at 51, 53 crossroads. Crossroads is nothing. In the last column, he likes factors of 12 but instead of 1 and 2, he prefers 11. So that's where 3, 4, 6, 12, and 11 come from. And that's in the last column. Then you fill in the middle columns with 7, 9, and 10. Just memorize it. What now? I can. So I have a brother who's 28 first row. He lives at 51, 53 crossroads in the middle. The last column is he likes factors of 12, but instead of 1 and 2, he prefers 11. Because, right, if you add 1 and 2, that would be all factors of 12. But add 11 and take away 1 and 2. And then in the middle, you fill in 7, 9, and 10 in all of the middle columns. And we'll come over here and do the same thing. So I have a brother who is 28, first column, sorry. He lives at 51, 53 crossroads is nothing. That goes in the middle. Last column, he likes factors of 12, but instead of 1 and 2, he prefers 11. So 3, 4, 6, 12, and 11. And then the middle columns get filled in with 7, 9, and 10. So this chart allows you to pick out all the fiber types in each nerve. So if I were to ask you which of the following sets of fiber types are found in cranial nerve 7, you could look at that table and tell me, right? If I asked you which of the following fiber types are found in cranial nerve 5, you'd be able to look at that chart and tell me, right? Okay, so this is extremely helpful. Memorize it. Be able to regurgitate it and reproduce it. The easiest thing to do is every time you sit down to study, just write it out first before you start. Okay? The thing at the top is just something that I do. You do not have to do it. It just helps me keep the fiber types separate in my brain. So it's just like it's just 2 or 3 words that tell me what each of those fiber types are doing. Because you might actually have a question that says, which of the following sets of nerves contain fibers for taste and smell? So it might not necessarily give you SVA. Okay? So I just kind of come up with like 2 or 3 words just to help me remember which each and every one of them are. If you can't read them, I'll read them to you. The first one is vision and audiovestibular. The second one is pharyngeal skeletal muscles, motor. I'll explain that in a second. The next one is taste and smell. Then GSA is general tactile sensation. GVE is motor for the parasympathetic sympathetic system. GVA is visceral sensation. And GSE is skeletal muscle motor. You do not have to know that. That's just something that I did when I was learning that helped me remember. Okay. Before I start studying and then on my test, when I got my test, the first thing I did was I flipped over to the back and I wrote out both of those charts on the back of my test. So that way in your test, when you get to a question, you just flip over to the back, look at your chart, fill in the blank, and keep going. Okay? Try to memorize how to regurgitate that chart, okay? Say Virginia, say base. I have a brother who was 28. First column was at 53. 51, 53 crossroads. Crossroads means nothing. That's in the middle row, middle column. First row, middle columns. He likes factors of 12, except instead of 1 and 2, he likes 11. And then fill in the middle columns with 7, 9, and 10. Make that your best friend. So we pick up 3 fiber types to add to our 4 that we are used to from the last few tests. So they are SSA, SVA, and SVE. So SSA, these are all special because they are confined to the cranial vault. Okay? That's why you didn't get to them until now. So SSA is a special somatic afferent. It is going to give you vision and audiovestibular sensation. Okay, so these are the sensory fibers for vision, hearing, and balance. SVA, special visceral afferents. This is the sensation of taste and smell. So both of those are sensory fibers. Okay. SVE, these are interesting little motor fibers because they come from a particular form of development. So they come from neural crest cells that evolve and they involve, those neural crest cells, they have all three levels. They have the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. And as they migrate, they actually, from each of these, what we call pharyngeal arches, throughout development, they migrate and transform into different things. Okay, so there are 6 pharyngeal arches. The 5th one egresses and does not form anything. So you really have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. 4 and 6 form together as a unit. If you have an old Morse book, so in my Morse book, it was in the Morse book on page 282, and it was table 8.5. I'm not sure if you use your Morse book, but there's a table in there that has all this in there. But the first arch in development is going to give you cranial nerve 5. That arch is also going to give you the SVE innervated skeletal muscles that are innervated by cranial nerve 5. Okay? Those muscles, I'm going to list them for you. They are the muscles of mastication, the mylohyoid, the anterior belly of the digastric, the tensor tympani, and the tensor bailey palantini. I'll say them again. The muscles of mastication, the mylohyoid, the anterior belly of the digastric, the tensor tympani, and the tensor bailey palantini.
You said those were all SVE?
Yes, so all of those muscles are going to be innervated by SVE fibers. Muscles of mastication, the mylohyoid, anterior belly of the digastric, tensor tympani, and tensor bailey palantini. So cranial nerve 5 is going to innervate those muscles by SVE fibers. I'm not going to ask you to memorize the cartilage that comes from the arch, but just know that it has associated cartilage. They're not going to test you on that. That might be something that you might get a question on your embryo test, but not on your anatomy test. And if you're like me, embryo. Just pass it. Okay. The second one is arch 2. Arch 2 is going to give you cranial nerve 7. For cranial nerve 7, to make it easy, it is going to innervate the muscles of facial expressions. You know, there's a ton of them, but you can group them together as the muscles of facial expression. And then 3 more, besides the muscles of facial expression. The stapedius, the stylohyoid, and the posterior belly of the digastric. Muscles of facial expression, stapedius, stylohyoid, and posterior belly of the digastric. So those muscles are going to be innervated by SVE fibers that come from cranial nerve 7. The third arch is going to give you cranial nerve 9. It only has one muscle, and that is the stylopharyngeus. And then the fourth and fifth arch are going to give you cranial nerve 10. And it is going to innervate the muscles of the soft palate, the pharynx, larynx, and esophagus. So arches 4 and 6 are going to give you cranial nerve 10, and it's going to innervate muscles of the soft palate, pharynx, larynx, and esophagus. Okay, so that is where
that's all. Just
that is what these are talking about. And as we we go through the actual cranial nerves, I'll break them down and tell you exactly which is doing which as we move through it. But you need to understand what I'm talking about when I say that. Okay, so when I say that cranial nerve 5 has got SVEs that are innervating the muscles of mastication, you need to understand why that is. It's because they all came from the same pharyngeal arch in development. Okay, and that's why those muscles are different from the other skeletal muscles that we have that are innervated by GSEs. Okay? Alright, let's talk about, if I can find an eraser. Let's talk about how cranial nerves are different from spinal nerves. Okay. This will also probably help you keep some things straight in your brain. Okay. So for motor innervation for both spinal and cranial nerves, you've got 2 separate neurons. Okay? And I'm talking about general fibers. Okay? So not your specials, these are your generals. Okay? For your spinal nerves, remember your first neuron is what we call the upper motor neuron. For those of you who can't read that, that says the upper motor neuron in the cerebral cortex. I think these lights are just blown. Because those 2 over there are owned, just these aren't owned. That's why it's maybe so dark. Sorry about that. So upper motor neuron in the cerebral cortex. It's going to synapse on a lower motor neuron that's in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. All right, everybody remembers that, right? So that's like up here, there's a neuron, it goes down and synapses down here, and then this one leaves and goes out and performs a function. All right, everybody remembers that from like the first time we ever met. Okay? So cranial nerves are a tinge different. So their upper motor neuron is also in the cortex. But their lower motor neuron is a little bit different. Their lower motor neurons is in something called a motor nucleus, and it's in their brainstem. Okay, so let's just pretend, let's do a cross section and talk about the difference. Okay, so this is a spinal cord transection, right? So everybody remembers this up here is ventral horn. This is dorsal horn and this is ventral horn. So this is sensory coming in and this is motor going out. Everybody remembers that, right? So this is a cross section of like the midbrain. Okay, so instead of having like this discrete, like butterfly-shaped area where all your cell bodies are located all together, instead you've got these like collections of nuclei that are organized into different, you've got these collections of cell bodies that are organized into different nuclei, okay? So you might have this group right here, that might be a collection of cell bodies, and this might be a motor nucleus. And this down here might be a collection of cell bodies, and this is a sensory nucleus. Okay? So it's not the same as this. Okay? So don't, just in your brain, understand that when you get down into the brainstem, or up into the brainstem, it's not organized front and back like this. Things are all mixed up. So you might also have a sensory nucleus up here, and you might have a motor nucleus right here. Okay? So things are organized very differently. Each cranial nerve has its own set of nuclei that belong to it. And that nuclei is going to house collections of these fibers. So if we look at cranial nerve, let's just pick one for fun. Let's look at cranial nerve 5. Cranial nerve 5 is going to have 2 separate nuclei associated with it. One, because it's both, one of them is going to be a sensory nuclei, and the other is going to be a motor nucleus. Okay, does that make sense? So organization is very different when you talk about cranial nerves. Okay, so that's the motor aspect. Let's talk about the sensory aspect. All right, when you talk about the spinal cord, do you remember this guy? That guy right there. What's he called? DRG, absolutely. So for the spinal nerves, your primary sensory cell body is in the DRG. Okay? So remember, that's a dorsal root ganglia. A ganglia is just a collection of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Okay? DRGs in particular are collections of nothing but sensory cell bodies. Okay? They are going to feed back their input on a secondary sensory cell body that is found in the dorsal horn. Of the spinal cord. So they are going to have a cell body who's going to go down and synapse on the dorsal horn. Right? All this is making sense. We've seen this before. From there, that cell body from the dorsal horn is going to go synapse on a cell body in the thalamus. Okay? So then, the thalamus is going to go synapse on the cortex. Okay, so again, that primary sensory cell body is in the DRG. It's going to synapse on a cell body that's in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. It's going to go synapse on a cell body in the thalamus, and then the thalamus is going to go tell the cortex what happened. Okay? That's spinal sensory input. So how are cranial nerves different? So their version of a DRG is called a sensory ganglia. So you can think of the cranial nerves as having a collection of cells that function just like a DRG. They're just not called a DRG. Okay? And certain cranial nerves have their own that have a special name, and we'll talk about those in just a second. Okay? but they're not called the DRG, but they function just like a DRG. But like the DRG for cranial nerve 5 is very different than the DRG for cranial nerve 7. Okay, so we'll talk about how they're different in just a second. Okay, so the sensory ganglia is going to send its fiber to synapse on the sensory nucleus, which is what I actually just erased. So it's going to go synapse on one of those little collections of sensory cell bodies in the brainstem. And then that is going to go synapse on the thalamus. So let's talk for just a second about this. These sensory ganglia. There are certain ones that you need to know. So each of these cranial nerves, they have their own special DRG, which is their sensory ganglia, okay, and they have names. For cranial nerve 5, it is called the geniculate, or trigeminal. I've lost my mind. Semilunar. I bet you're like, no, it's not. Okay. You're like, yeah, that's right. Semilunar. It looks like a half moon. Okay. So the trigeminal is also called the semilunar. When you see those, they're interchangeable. Some texts will refer to it as semilunar the whole time, and some of them will refer to it as the trigeminal. They are the same thing. It's like the DRG of cranial nerve 5. Okay? So that is where all of the cell bodies for the sensation of cranial nerve 5 are housed. They're all housed in the semilunar ganglia. Okay? So when you talk about cranial nerve 5,
you said all sensory nerves?
All sensory fibers.
Fibers.
Yeah. So you know, when you talk about cranial nerve 5, it's got like this fat part before it branches into B1, B2, and B3. This is the semilunar ganglia. Right? So right now we're talking about, you look in the bottom, like if you look inside your skull, you'll see where this lives. Like right there at like the bottom of the, like the features part of the temporal bone. Okay? So that is the semilunar ganglia. This is like the DRG of cranial nerve 5. So, let me see if I can explain it to you where it makes sense. So all of your tactile sensation, your general tactile sensation for cranial nerve 5, all of those cell bodies that have sensory input on the outside, they're all living right here. Then they're going to go synapse on its sensory nucleus that's in the spinal cord. Okay, that's where the next cell body is. And then it's going to go up to the thalamus and synapse, and then the thalamus is going to go tell the cortex what happened. Okay? So let's do 7. 7's name is geniculate. Okay? So, the DRG of cranial nerve 7 has a special name. It's called the geniculate. Okay, so let's talk about it relative to this. So, we've got, if you look at sensories, you look at all the A's for 7, you've got SVAs for taste, and then you've got tactile sensation for 7, and you've got visceral sensation for 7. Right? So you've got a lot of sensory fiber types for 7. Every one of those fiber types, cell body, is found in the geniculate ganglia. Okay? So the geniculate ganglia houses all the cell bodies for every one of those sensory fiber types. Okay?
Is there a synapse in there?
No synapses. So remember, it's what we call a pseudo-unipolar ganglia. So where the ganglia is, you've got the cell body, and then it's got a fiber coming this way and this way. So this one is picking it up from the outside. Its cell body lives in the DRG or the geniculate ganglia, and it's going to synapse in the brainstem. No synapsing is happening. Good question. Good question. Everybody understands that concept, right? Sensory ganglia, no synapses have to happen. Okay? All right. That sensory ganglia, the geniculate ganglia, which is housing all of those different fiber type cell bodies, is sending its fiber back to the brainstem to synapse on a sensory nucleus. Okay? Each fiber type is going to its own sensory nucleus. Okay? So that means that taste and smell is going to its own nucleus. And then visceral sensation is going to its own nucleus. Tactile sensation is going to its own nucleus. Okay? So after the geniculate ganglia, where all those cell bodies are, then it separates into its different nuclei. Okay? Because cranial nerve 7 has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different nuclei in the brainstem. That makes sense? Okay. All right, cranial nerve 8. Vestibular. Let me get you the other name that it's called sometimes. Sometimes you'll see it called scarpa. Okay, those are the same thing. And then the other one for cranial nerve 8 is the cochlear, which is also called the spiral. So kind of think of cranial nerve 8 as two different nerves bound together. Half of cranial nerve 8 is doing vestibular, so it's doing like balance and proprioception. The rest of cranial nerve 8 is doing hearing. Okay? So the sensory from the vestibular system is going to the vestibular or Scarpa's ganglia, same thing. And the sensory fibers for hearing are going to be going from the cochlear or spiral ganglia. They're the same thing. So those words are used interchangeably. Okay? So that's this guy. Okay? Cranial nerve 9 and 10 are kind of weird. Because their ganglia have the same name, but they are different. Okay? Cranial nerve 9 has two ganglia. One is called the superior, and the other one is called the inferior. Brilliantly enough, cranial nerve 10 also has two, called the superior and inferior. cranial nerve 9 has two different sensory ganglia, superior and inferior, and cranial nerve 10 has two different, and they're called superior and inferior. They are not the same ganglia. Okay, so this superior is only for 9, and this superior is only for 10. So don't think of them as just two that are getting 9 and 10. They are different. 9 has its own 2, and 10 has its own 2. They just weren't clever enough to come up with names that made them different. Okay, so now when you are reading about these things, you will understand that when you read these words, all this is telling you is that these are the cranial nerve's own special DRGs that are housing the cell bodies of these sensory fibers for that nerve. Okay? Okay. That was awesome. Alright, so let's talk. Let's move forward just a tinge. And let's talk about the autonomic system. Yes.
So cranial nerve 1 is going to have its own.
It's a great question.
Or cranial nerve 2 is going to have its own. That's what you mean?
Yes.
That's the only ones that we need to be familiar with.
These are the only ones that you need to know that function as to have their own name. I'll explain those when we get there, and you'll see why they're a little bit different.
Also, when we read it in the book, will it say superior ganglion of cranial nerve 9, or will it read as?
It'll probably be under the same heading. So if you're reading about cranial nerve 9, it's just going to say superior ganglia, inferior ganglia. Yeah, it won't be too confusing as long as you understand. The way people get confused is when they think that there's only two and they're doing the same thing for both nerves, and they're not.
Does cranial nerve 1 for olfaction, does that go to the thalamus, or does it bypass the thalamus?
It's a little different. You do not have to know all of that. You'll get to all of that. It does go to the thalamus, but it does it by a very, very different way than every other cranial nerve. And you do not have to know that for gross anatomy. You'll learn that when you get to neuro. It goes to the thalamus in a super weird way, and that's why, when you smell things, you think of certain things, because it also synapses on part of the thalamus that controls memory. It's kind of cool, but you'll learn all about it when you do neuro. All right, let's talk about the autonomic system. Autonomic system, and then we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll go through 3 or 4 cranial nerves, and then we'll be done, okay? So just hang with me for the next 10 minutes, and then we'll take a break. Alright, the autonomic system. So let's talk about how the autonomic system is different inside the head, okay? So let's do sympathetics first. Okay, so sympathetics y'all know this. Where are the preganglionic cell bodies for the sympathetic system? Awesome. IMLCC. Good. The postganglionic for the sympathetics that are going into the cranial vault are found where? Good. Cervical ganglia. For the ease of simplicity, if you'll just know that the majority of them are in the superior, but it does use all 3. Okay, but the majority, the overwhelming majority of them are in the superior. That's the one you'll be tested on. Okay. So the preganglionic cell bodies leave the IMLCC. They do everything they've done every other time. And they go up here and they synapse on the superior cervical ganglia. Okay? Then your postganglionic fibers that leave the superior cervical ganglia are going to ride branches of the internal carotid artery to get inside the cranial vault.
These are going towards the superior cervical ganglia, or
So these are postganglionic fibers from the superior cervical ganglia. So your postganglionic fibers that leave the superior cervical ganglia are going to hop on the internal carotid artery, and they're going to follow it up into the head. Have y'all dissected out the internal carotid artery, like up in, like right into here? No? So if you did, you'll notice that you had to cut away like this really fibrous sheath around it, and that's what this is. That's what that was. So you were cutting away all these fibers, all your sympathetic fibers. So like if you're looking in the lab, you'll notice that some people's carotid arteries are really smooth and like they're just pretty. They're smooth and pretty. You can see like the wall, and then some of them look like they got like this nasty, ratty like fiber around them. That's what that is.
So you don't mean the carotid sheath?
Not the carotid sheath. It's inside the carotid sheath. It's actually like on the vessel itself. You have to actually like cut it off to get to the smooth wall of the vessel on the outside. Okay? So postganglionic fibers are going to ride branches of the internal carotid artery to get in the cranial vault. And then they're going to follow it as far as they can to get to their target. Okay? So sometimes they'll be able to follow the vessel all the way to the target, and then sometimes they'll actually have to hop off the vessel and hop on a different nerve to get there. Okay? If there's anything in particular you have to know, I'll tell you what it is. Like there's a couple that you do have to know, and I'll tell you when we get there. But for the most part, just know that postganglionic fibers, sympathetic fibers, ride branches of the internal carotid artery to get into the cranial vault to get to their target. Okay? All right, so here is where things get very different. Okay. So do you remember when we first learned about the parasympathetic system? We talked about how it was kind of divided into two separate sections. So you had S2, 3, and 4 down in the sacral spinal cord, and then you had these cranial nerves up in the top of the brainstem. And I was like, don't worry about that. You don't have to know it until you get to head and neck. Well, that's where we are. Okay. Okay. So the three that you have to know are cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. Okay. So just like, I don't remember if you can reach back into your memory banks, and you'll remember when we talked about the parasympathetics down in the spinal cord. I told you that they were contained in the spinal cord in their own little nucleus. It just didn't have a name. Like this has its own name, right? So these are the same way. So they are contained for each cranial nerve as a little collection together as a nucleus for each cranial nerve. And they each have their own name. And you have to know their names. Okay? So cranial nerve 3. So cranial nerve 3 has a nucleus that is called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Edinger Westphal. Westphal. Edinger-Westphal. That is the name of the nucleus for cranial nerve 3 that houses the cell bodies of your GBEs, your parasympathetics for cranial nerve 3. Okay? It's called called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Cranial nerve 7 has its own. It's called the superior salivatory nucleus. I don't know why my writing wants to go like uphill. Superior salivatory nucleus. Cranial nerve 9 is the inferior salivatory nucleus. And cranial nerve 10 is called the dorsal motor nucleus. What now? Yes, they are little dots in the brainstem. Just like when I drew that little cross section and I had like those circles, that is one of these.
And this is where they synapse?
This is
Their
where
final destination is.
this is where the primary cell body is. So think about it as this for the parasympathetic system.
Okay.
Okay? It's going to make sense in just a second when I keep going. Okay?
Making space over there.
So these are the location of your pre-ganglionic parasympathetic cell bodies. Okay? I'll say that again. These nuclei are the location of your pre-ganglionic parasympathetic cell bodies. So think of these as the same thing as S234. We're just up in the brainstem. And they are confined to each cranial nerve. So each cranial nerve has its own collection. And it has a special name. Okay? So do you remember when we talked about, I'm trying not to confuse y'all by saying this, but do you remember when we talked about the sympathetic system down in the body? And I told you how certain ones down in the thorax and abdomen, when they left, they were looking for a ganglia, right? They were looking for their postganglionic cell bodies. Remember? It's the same thing, okay? These cell bodies are going to send out a fiber, and they're going to be looking for their postganglionic cell bodies, okay? They each are going to a particular ganglia that you also have to know the name of. Don't hate me. I don't hate the messenger. Okay? So, it's not terrible. So, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus is going to send out preganglionic fibers that are looking for cell bodies
Crazy.
in the ciliary ganglia.
Oh.
I got this. Check this out. Get out of here.
Do you mean the ciliary ganglion in the eye?
Oh,
It is in the eye. Or it's by the eye.
By, okay.
Not the ciliary muscle. That's different. That's in the eye. This is a ganglia. It's a group of cell bodies by the eye.
We had to find a nasociliary ganglion and ciliary ganglion within our eye during one dissection. It's right near the optic nerve.
Yes, that's probably what you're looking for, maybe. I'll explain it when we get to it. So preganglionics from the Edinger-Westphal nucleus are going to leave the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and they are going out looking for their postganglionic cell bodies. The ones that leave the Edger-Westphal are going looking for the ciliary ganglia. Okay? And then postganglionic fibers from the ciliary ganglia are going to go look for their target, and we'll talk about those when we get there. Okay? Okay. Superior salivatory, it's going to two different ganglia. Of course it is. Okay? It's going to something called the pterygopalatine. Pterygopalatine ganglia. And some other ones from the superior salivatory are going to the submandibular ganglia. So some of them are going to find postganglionic cell bodies in the pterygopalatine ganglia, and some of them are going to find postganglionic cell bodies in the submandibular ganglia. I promise it'll make sense when we get to these particular cranial nerves. We'll draw it out and you'll know exactly where everything's going. Alright, inferior salivatory nucleus. It's going to a ganglia called the otic. O-T-I-C. The otic ganglia. Okay? And then the last one, the dorsal motor nucleus, you'll remember. You will. Remember, it doesn't do anything inside the cranial vault, right? So it actually leaves the cranial vault, and it's going to do all of your parasympathetics to the level of the splenic flexure, right? So it is doing what we were talking about down in the pelvis. So it's synapsing on these tiny little ganglia that don't have names, that are either right next to the target or right inside the wall of the target. Okay? So these are the ones that don't have particular names, and they're all throughout the thorax and into the abdomen to the level of the splenic flexure.
Because that's the vagus nerve?
That's the vagus. So inside the head, these are really the only new ones that you have to learn the pathway for. And when we get to each of those cranial nerves, we'll actually draw it out and say where they're going and what they're doing. Okay? So again, I'm going to run through these verbally real fast, and then we'll take a break, and we'll come back and we'll start with cranial nerve 1. Okay, cranial nerve 3. Its GVE fibers, its preganglionic GVE fibers are found in a nucleus, a collection in the brainstem called the Edger-Westphal nucleus. Those preganglionic cell bodies are sending out preganglionic fibers that are looking for the ciliary ganglia. They're going to synapse on the ciliary ganglia, and then the postganglionic fibers that leave the ciliary ganglia are going to go innervate a target. Okay? Same thing all the way down. Cranial nerve 7 has a group of GVEs, parasympathetic preganglionic fibers, and their cell bodies are in a group called the superior salivatory nucleus. It's sending out its preganglionic fibers. Some of them are synapsing on the pterygopalatine, and some of them are on the submandibular ganglia. From there, postganglionic fibers are going to go synapse on their target. Cranial nerve 9 has a group of GVEs that are preganglionic in a nucleus in the brainstem called the inferior salivatory nucleus. It's sending out its preganglionic fibers looking for the otic ganglia. From there, the otic ganglia will send postganglionic fibers to its target. The only other thing I have to add here is the counterpart to this. Okay? So in the brain, just like your sympathetic postganglionic fibers are having to ride things to get to their target, so are these. So when these post-ganglionic fibers leave these ganglia, they are going to ride something to get to their target. And this is where people get so confused. So listen to me carefully. They are always going to ride a branch of cranial nerve 5 to get to their target. But there are no GBEs in cranial nerve 5, right? If there was, there would be a 5 right here. Okay? They are not part of cranial nerve 5. Just like these fibers are not part of an artery, right? They're just riding an artery. These are just riding a nerve. So postganglionic fibers leave the ganglia and they ride branches of cranial nerve 5 to their target. Do not be confused by that. Just like these fibers are not an artery, these fibers are not cranial nerve 5. They are only following them to get to their target. Does that make sense to everybody? There are no GBEs in cranial nerve 5. None. They simply ride it to their location. Okay? That will, again, make more sense when we get to each nerve. Y'all take 10 minutes and come back, and we'll be done by 7. So I never claimed to be a good artist. So y'all bear with me. Okay. So for every cranial nerve, we'll go through these different parts. Okay, so the number of the name, is it motor, sensory, both? What fibers are in it? What foramen is it going through? The clinical points about it, and then how do you test for it? All right, so the first one we're doing is cranial nerve 1. It is the olfactory nerve. Is it motor, sensory, or both? Sensory only? What type of fibers does it have in it? SCA. And what are those SCA fibers doing? Just generally. Smell. Good. And what's its foramen? What is the foramen for cranial nerve 1? Cribriform plate. Good. So cribriform plate of the F point then. Okay. So clinically, let's talk about some clinical things. So what's it doing first? So up inside the nose, you've got these tiny little fibers that are coming down through the cribriform plate. In all actuality, these are cranial nerve 1, not the olfactory bulb. But because you cannot see them, everybody refers to the olfactory bulb as being cranial nerve 1. Okay? It's a misnomer. Okay? Cranial nerve 1 are really these sensory fibers right here that traverse the cribriform plate. Okay? So these sensory fibers that go through the cribriform plate, they pick up chemicals in the air that you breathe in. Okay? They transmit that to the olfactory bulb, which follows the olfactory tract by a very convoluted mechanism back to the thalamus.
I'm so sorry. Is that a nose or a nose?
This is a nose.
That's.
It's a really big nose. And
I got you.
that's funny. I told you I wasn't a good drawer now. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about why this is clinically important. Because there are 3 things that can happen as far as most clinical things I have to tell you are going to be injury patterns, okay? So the 3 injury patterns that you need to know are the different locations that you can have an issue. Okay? So the first one is at the epithelium. So it is here. So these little fibers are embedded at the very, very top of the epithelium in the most superior portion of the nose. So why is that important? Because think about what it feels like when you have like a stuffy nose, like when you got a cold, a chest cold, or like even a head cold, and you've got congestion. So let's say you've got like a bunch of snot in your nose. Can you smell with a bunch of snot in your nose? No, because that snot is a barrier that prevents these chemicals from getting to the receptors, which then transmit back to the brain. Okay? So you can have something at the epithelium, which most commonly is congestion, that would cause you to lose smell. The loss of smell is called anosmia. So you can have a problem there. The next place that you can have a problem is at the cribriform plate. Okay? So the most common thing to happen at the cribriform plate is trauma. And it's usually blunt force trauma to the head. So this is like someone who is in a car accident or a football player who gets hit really hard in the head. And there is enough trauma to cause the bulb, which is anchored to the brain, to move inside all that CSF that it's kind of bathed in, which acts as a cushion, and it causes what we call shearing force that actually tears away these receptors. So now, even if you don't have this, and now you can get the chemicals to the receptors, now they can't get back to the brain, right?
So the shearing force is what tears it away from the receptors?
Yes, the shearing force is what tears these little fibers that are going through the cribriform plate. So now, think about it as like if you were to put like a piece of hair down through those little holes in the cribriform plate that you've seen in the skull, and you were to anchor those hairs to your hand, and somebody came behind you and pushed your hand real hard, and those hairs were really taut, they would just break at the cribriform plate. Okay? You can also, when that happens, what you've done is you have broken the seal around the meningeal layer that protects the meninges, like that makes this form a closed circuit. So now you have a micromeningeal tear that can allow CSF to come down. Okay? When that happens, when you have CSF that leaks through the cribriform plate, it'll actually run out their nose. I've seen this twice in residency.
What's the CSF?
Rhinorrhea. So rhinorrhea, anything that ends in rhea means run, like diarrhea. So rhino, nose, runny nose. Okay? So CSF rhinorrhea. So it's just runny nose, but instead of it being snot, it's CSF.
And that CS fluid tears it away, or it's just there?
No, the CSF is coming out because you've broken that meningeal barrier. So now it has a way to get out. So it leaks through the cribriform plate and comes out your nose. Okay? The other place that you can have injury is here, at the bulbar tract. If you have any type of compression, so this would be like a tumor. So let's say you've got a big old meningioma, a big old brain tumor, and it's living right here. Now, everything works just great, right? Like your receptor can get to your fiber can go up, and then the bulb is going to send its fibers back to the brain, but all of a sudden, now they can't get back to the brain because they're being compressed by this big tumor that's sitting on them. Okay, so compression. So you can have epithelial blockage, you can have shearing force from trauma at the cribriform plate, or you can have compression to the tracker bulb. Those are the three most common reasons that you would have any type of problem with cranial nerve 1.
What is that word beside the tumor?
Usually, it's USU, is usually a tumor. It's my shorthand. And then testing. This is the easiest nerve to test and the one that we never do. So neurologists do it all the time. I think I've done it like once ever. And it's called the sniff test. And so most people will carry menthol in their pockets, like menthol chapstick, or sometimes they'll carry a little thing of coffee inside a medicine bottle. So it's just a really strong smell. And what they'll do is you just hold one side of your nose and you breathe in and you either smell it or you don't, and then you repeat the other side. And that's how they test it. Most of the time people use menthol chapstick. So it's super easy to test. Moving right along, cranial nerve 2. All right, cranial nerve 2. All right, the optic nerve. Is it motor, sensory, or both? Sensory. What fiber types does it have? SSA, and they're primarily doing what? Vision. Good. Its foramen is what? It's the optic canal. What else is going through the optic canal with the optic nerve? Ophthalmic artery. Good. So going through the optic canal, which is in what part, what bone? Lesser wing of the sphenoid. Good. All right. We'll do clinical in a second. So this one is a little bit more in depth than the last one. Okay. So, all right, so cranial nerve 2. So the main sensory function of cranial nerve 2 is the retina. So let's take, I'm going to kind of take a chunk of this eye and blow it up for you. And I'm going to make this be my optic nerve. Okay? So the retina is a multi-layer sensory structure that has tons of cells and receptors in them, okay? The most important of which is the one that you learned in elementary school, which are rods and cones. What did y'all say? What did you say? Oh, y'all said maybe college. Okay. So the rods and cones, they live in the deepest part. Alright, this is the inside of the eye. So we're looking from here, light is coming in, and I've taken this part right here. Okay, does everybody kind of see what, like, you have a frame of reference for where I am? So light is coming in. Pretend that we've taken this part of the eye and we've blown it up to look at it. Okay? So the retina is a multi-layer sensory structure that has multiple different cells and receptors and transmitters, the deepest of which houses your rods and cones. So does it make sense to you when the rods and cones are what interpret color and like dark vision, right? So does it make sense to you that when the light comes into your eye, it has to go all the way through everything to get to the first cells that interpret it? So it's got to go through all the different layers of the retina to get to the cells that are responsible for interpretation. Okay? So the light comes in, it goes all the way to the back of the retina, hits the rods and cones, and then the rods and cones are going to talk to all of the cells that live in the layers going back in. So it's kind of backwards from what you think it should be. It goes all the way through the retina to the deepest part, and then those cells talk going back inside to the other cells of the retina. The ones that live on the outside are called ganglia cells, because we haven't used the word ganglia nearly enough. Okay, the ganglia cells those cells are the ones that take the final message and they transmit it back through the optic nerve going to the brain. Okay, I will say that again. So light comes into the retina, and it shines all the way through all the different layers of the retina to get to the rods and cones, which are the deepest structure of the retina. They then take the message, and they interpret it all the way back through the retina to get all the way back to the innermost layer. Innermost meaning the inside of the eye layer. Okay? The last cell that they use is called the ganglia cells. The ganglia cells then send their fibers out through the optic nerve, which go back to the brain to tell the brain what the eye saw. So the optic nerve itself is made up of multi-millions of fibers from ganglia cells. Okay? That makes sense? So the optic nerve are just all the fibers from all these ganglion cells that are telling the brain what the rods and cones saw. Okay. So that is like the actual perception of the sensation. Okay, so let's talk about some other things that are interesting. The part right here where the optic nerve actually enters the back of the eye has a name. It's called the optic disc. The optic disc is the part of the eye where the nerve actually enters into the eyeball. It is also your blind spot, right? You can't have rods and cones where you got all the fibers leaving. So therefore you cannot interpret vision at the blind spot. So you can't interpret vision at the optic disc. Okay? The very back part right here is called the fovea. That is the point of the best vision of the eye. Okay? It is the part that's in direct line with the pupil and the lens, and has the highest number of cones. It's the best vision in the eye. Okay? F-O-V-E-A.
So your optic nerve doesn't actually come off a little off to the side.
Yes, it's kind of like on the medial aspect of the eyeball. Okay? Some other things to know are inside the optic nerve, there's a really important vessel. That vessel is called the central artery of the retina. The central artery of the retina is a branch of what artery? Ophthalmic. The ophthalmic is a branch of internal carotid. Good. So internal carotid gives you ophthalmic. Ophthalmic gives you central artery of the retina. Central artery of the retina is literally in the center of the optic nerve. Okay? That's important because it's going to pierce through into the eyeball, and then it's going to be the main blood supply to the retina. But pay attention to the way I've drawn it. It is the blood supply to the most inside part, right? Inside meaning the center of the eyeball, okay? That is really important because you've also got arterial supply from the outside. So why does this even matter? Because you've got all these different little vessels that are supplying the eye from the outside, and you've got the central artery of the retina supplying it from the inside. That's important because you need to understand that the only way the cells that live in the middle of the retina get blood supply is by diffusion. So you've got blood from the central artery of the retina going through the retina from the inside, and you've got these vessels on the outside giving blood towards the inside. So the middle of the retina is only supplied by vascular diffusion. We're going to talk about how that's really important in a minute. Okay? Okay. So the optic nerve is going to leave the eye. It's picking up the interpretation from the rising cones that went all the way to the most inside of the retina, and the ganglia cells are sending it back through the optic nerve. It's going to go back to the brain. It's going to intercept the other optic nerve here at the optic chiasm. And then you do not have to understand where all these different fibers are going and which part of the brain is seeing what part of the eye. That is neuroanatomy, and you will learn it when you get there. So all this homonymous hemianopsia and hemianopia and all that, you not have to know it. Okay? That's neuro. There's a lot of different ones. So they're just branches of the ophthalmic. There's like a superior ophthalmic and inferior ophthalmic. Okay.
Is that another branch?
What you do need to know.
Branch of the ophthalmic, it's on the back of the eye.
But this is a branch of the central.
Or why all this stuff is clinically significant.
They're two different branches, I think.
So there are a few clinical things that you need to know about the eye. Okay. One of them is a fancy word called papilledema. So papilledema, all that is swelling of the optic disc. That usually is because something out here in the inside of the brain is putting pressure from the inside of the brain that's causing all that pressure to be transmitted like towards the inside of the eye. So this part right here where it pierces through the eye, so it's covered by meninges all the way to the eyeball. But right here, it's actually the weakest part of the eye because it pierces through that outer covering of the eye. So when you've got something in the brain that's causing pressure, you've got all that CSF that doesn't have anywhere else to go because it's in a closed circuit, right? In a closed system, right? So now that CSF is pushing as hard as it can into the weakest part right there, and so it bulges in. So when you look at it from the inside, it actually looks like this. So you see it from the inside, it actually like cups over and looks swollen, okay? So when you look at it from the inside, looking through the pupil to the back of the eye, you'll see this kind of cup over, and it kind of looks like a donut, okay? So it looks like you got a donut and you're pushing into the eyeball with the donut. Does that make sense? That's what papilledema means. It's just edema, so pressure and swelling that's causing that bulging of the optic disc. Okay? So if you see that word, you'll know what it means.
What symptoms will you exhibit?
What now?
What symptoms will you exhibit?
You'll have loss, like you'll have cloudy vision and like visual disturbances and decreased visual acuity.
But you can still see, correct?
You can still see, yeah. You just have some visual changes, like loss of visual acuity. Let me spell this right. I already spelled it wrong. The next one that you have to know is amaurosis fugale. So this is transient loss of vision. You don't have to spell it right, just know what it is. I think I probably even this point not is the right way to spell it. Amaurosis fugale. So this is transient loss of vision. And it can be because of many things, okay? The most common of which is a spasm in the artery, okay? So the muscular lining of the arterial wall will actually spasm and the artery will kind of clamp itself down. And for a brief moment of time, you'll lose vascular supply and you'll have transient blindness, okay? But it'll come back. That's the most common reason, is because of a spasm of the artery.
How transient
It's different for different people. So some people it might last like a few seconds, some people it might last a few minutes. You can't go longer than like hours though, or you'll like your cells will die.
So, is it just in the one
It's just in the eye where you have that like if it's an artery problem, it's just that artery and just that eye. The other eye's fine. Alright, amaurosis fugale. It's transient loss of vision, most commonly from a spasm of an artery. Okay?
What causes an artery to spasm?
You know, a lot of different things. Cocaine will do it. So it's just clamping down on the muscles because you like block your calcium channels. Or you can just have like just random spasms. Like people who have MS have it sometimes just because you've got all kind of different stuff happening. But it's lots of different things that will do it. Okay? The next one is occlusion of the central artery of the retina. Alright, occlusion of the central artery of the retina. If you occlude this sole, one like singular blood supply to the innermost part of the retina, and these cells out here depend on it, that makes sense to you that without blood supply, these cells can't work, right? Because this blood supply coming in will never reach all the way in the inside. And this blood supply going out will never reach all the way to the outside. That's why you have to have them both. Okay? So if you have something that occludes this singular blood supply to your whole eye, these cells on the innermost area of the retina will die. Okay? Because blood brings oxygen and nutrients, and without oxygen and nutrients, things can't live. So if you have an occlusion of the central artery of the retina, you have monocular vision loss in that eye. Okay? So common things, being common, the most common thing that'll do this is like an embolus. So like a tiny little blood clot. So a blood clot, like a little, think about it, a little bitty tiny blood clot doesn't cause any problems in a big old artery, right? It's not going to stop up anything in a big old artery, but it's going to keep going until it gets to an area that's small enough where it can't get past it, and then it's going to plug it up. So this would be like a tiny embolism. That embolism could be a blood clot, it could be bacteria, it could be anything.
So this would cause vision loss probably like really quickly, where it's like.
Absolute. Yes. Very, very quickly. We're going to talk about the difference in the speed in just a second.
So, for all of these, if you just go and see a doctor as soon as it's happening, can they save it or they have to wait?
This is like a matter of like a few hours. Yeah. You can save it, but it's really hard because there's not any vascular intervention you can do to get there because it's so small. Okay, the next thing is retinal detachment. So retinal detachment happens like this. It's, for some reason, the retina, where the retina attaches to the back of the eye, pulls away. So now, again, we're left with the perfusion problem, right? Now, this blood that comes in from this way can't get itself to these inner cells. Okay? But this is different, right? Because you're only going to lose vision in this area because everything else is okay. Right? That's different than if you have an occlusion of the central artery of the retina that's supplying the entire retina. You lose your entire vision in that eye if you have occlusion of the central artery. But if you have a retinal detachment, you will only lose vision in the area where it is detached because you lose perfusion to those inner cells. So like if you mess up this connection right here, it doesn't matter which cells on either side work if you can't get the message all the way across. So if they lose diffusion from the outside coming in, you'll have a blind spot, okay? But you won't have full loss of vision in your eye. You'll just be blind in the spot where that retina is detached. This happens a lot in older people. Like my dad just had it last year, and like I freaked out, and I was like, oh my God, you're having a stroke. And like my neighbor is an ophthalmologist, so of course I called him up and woke him up in the middle of the night, and they went up to the ophthalmology tower, and he like looked in his eye, and he was like, it's just a detachment. I was like, what do you mean it's just a detachment? And he was like, well, he'll probably just get used to it. He'll just have a blind spot, and he'll get used to it. And I was like, that sounds terrible. And he was like, oh, he'll be fine. So he does. He has a blind spot. So your body just starts to ignore it. So it's like just a blind spot in your vision, and you just forget that it's there over time, and you just move right along with life.
There's no way to.
Wait a minute, so does it impair you from like driving or something?
Depends on how big it is. If it's really big, you have to do emergency surgery and put it back down. But if it's just a tiny little bit, nope. You just lose vision there, and you just keep trucking right along. Yeah, kind of like you don't see your blind spot right now. You just learn to ignore it. Your brain learns to ignore it. Okay, so the next one. Okay. The next one is up here. So a pituitary tumor. So if you have a tumor in your pituitary, which lives right beside the optic chiasm, so where I drew the six, that's supposed to be my rendition of the optic chiasm. Okay? So a pituitary tumor that gets large enough, that lives right there in the fossa, it can't grow once it gets so big, the fossa itself keeps it from growing into the bone, right? Because it's anchored by bone. So the next place that it goes is up into that nerve that's living right there. So it'll actually end up, the bigger it gets, it'll end up pressing on the optic chiasm. For those of you who really want to learn the extra thing and go the extra mile, I'm going to tell you what it's called. You don't have to know this. Okay, this causes something called bitemporal hemianopsia. So that means that at the optic chiasm, that is where your temporal vision from each eye crosses to the other side of the brain. Okay? So that's like, if I'm looking at the door, that's like my ability to see this wall and this wall. They cross from the right side to the left side and the left side to the right side at the optic chiasm. So if I've got something that's pressing at that crossing and it's cutting off the ability of that message to get to my brain, then when I look frontwards, I have no temporal vision. Does that make sense? Again, you don't have to know that. But if you see it written, you'll know what it is. Okay? Hemi means half, bitemporal, both temporal. So the temporal half of your vision, anopsia, can't see, so no seeing the temporal halves of your vision. That's what that means.
The same thing as
Kind of. So peripheral vision, you can actually have some peripheral vision on this periphery too. So like this eye's peripheral vision is right here. Like you have medial peripheral vision for each eye too. So it's the peripheral vision from the lateral aspect. Okay? So, let me see what else. Okay. Testing. Okay. There's a few things that you do to test. The first thing that you do is you look into the eye. You actually take an ophthalmoscopy, and you look into the eye with the ophthalmoscope. Okay? And what you're looking for is this. So you're looking to see what your disc looks like to make sure there's no edema. And then you're looking at these blood vessels. So if you ever get the opportunity to look in somebody's eye, you should. It's really cool. So you can actually see the central artery of the retina come in, and then you see it break itself out into all of its blood vessels in the back of the eye. It's really cool looking. Kind of makes like this cool map of arteries. And you can see them very, very well. They're really pretty. You can see all the places they go and meet. So the first thing you do when you're testing is you look into the eye, and you're looking at the disc and at those arteries. Okay? The next thing you do is you do visual field testing and visual acuity. So that is when they make acuity is when they make you stand the 20, 30 feet, whatever it is. My husband would die if I hear me say not that I didn't know that distance. If it's 20 or 30, it's something like that. And they make you look at the Snellen chart that has the big E on it with all the letters underneath it. You know what I'm talking about? And they tell you to read the lowest line that you can with your hand over each eye. So that is testing your acuity. So that tells you are you 20, 20, 20, 30, 20, 40, 2100, that kind of thing. Okay? Visual field testing. This is where they look at you and they say cover your left eye. Yep. And don't look out of the eye that your hand is covering and look straight at my nose. Don't cheat, look just at my nose. And tell me how many fingers I'm holding up. Don't look at my fingers, look at my nose.
2, 1, 3, 2.
Good. Did you say she's strong? So that's visual field testing. The other part of visual field testing is when they say, look at my nose and tell me when you can see both my fingers moving.
Right.
Now? Okay. So you're testing the visual fields in each eye and your peripheral vision. Okay? So ophthalmoscopy, visual fields, and visual acuity. And then the last thing they love to test is something called the pupillary light reflex. You know they love a reflex. Okay. So when we do cranial nerve 3 next time, we'll talk about it much more in depth. But pupillary light reflex uses cranial nerve 2 and 3. Cranial nerve 2 is the sensory limb, and cranial nerve 3 is the motor limb. So this is where you shine the light in their eye and their pupil, and the pupil constricts to the light in each eye. We'll talk about how that works next time. But the pupillary light reflex does cranial nerve 2 as the sensory limb. Okay? So next time we will do cranial nerves 3, 4, 5, 6, and maybe 7 if we have time.
The time.
Hey guys. Hey guys. Hey. So question. I heard that y'all get out of your test on Wednesday earlier than I thought you did. Do y'all want to do